art begins to recognize the limits of Romantic era emotionalism as the reality of life seems to comport less and less with romantic ideals. So over time, you start to get a sober, more clear picture of life portrayed through art, to the degree that life itself becomes the subject more than the art itself. So here, what we're talking about is realism, where truth is greater than art. That is the primary focus of it. You can see in realism the attempt to represent subject matter truthfully without artificiality, while avoiding artistic conventions, implausible exotic elements, and/or supernatural elements. Realists reject romanticism for its emphasis on fantasy and subjectivity. You can see this particularly in the romantic emphasis on sensationalism, on stimulating and exciting their readers, particularly the Gothic strain of Romanticism, leading probably most famously through the novel, Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, where horror and anxiety and the specialness of an individual is held at a premium. And over time, people begin to pull back from that and see, well, it is all very fake. And how can I relate to that? How can I relate to how can I relate to Dr. Frankenstein? How can I relate to a mad scientist? How can I relate to anything when you're just trying to cloud me up with all sorts of spooky style? Realism seeks to push that back. Push back the make-believe, push back the artifice, push back the fakeness of art to try and present a world more objectively. This comes amid a complicated period of history. The conflicting forces of modernization and tradition, emotion and reason, progressively destabilize societies and individuals alike. Culture reacts by grasping for certainty while admitting the underlying uncertainty of our existence. The world was very complicated at that moment, and things were in a state of great flux. So when the culture begins to scramble around and realize, okay, the world is too uncertain to begin with, I need something more stable in art. I need art to help me reflect on the instability of the world. Where do I turn? What can I look for? Well, the world was complicated. Just look at this one period. 1854, the electric light bulb is invented. Just think about the revolution that this provides. Darkness is no longer a defining feature of your life. You can turn on a light and have another couple hours in the evening to enjoy family life, to enjoy your home, to read, to just exist, as opposed to being forced to rise and retire with the sun. 1848, just a couple years later, all of Europe, in the span of 1 year, one calendar year, essentially all of Europe has revolutions. Every country essentially comes up and they have a populist uprising. This is the same year, famously, that the Communist Manifesto is published. This is a sense of suddenly politically the world is very active and very volatile. 1859, Darwin's Origin of the Species is published. Just think about that. Your very notion of the created world is now uprooted. 1861, Russia frees its serfs and the U.S. Civil War begins. This is real bloodshed in the U.S. Civil War, but the entire social order is in question. The whole notion of slavery is being worked out on two different sides of the globe with some, quite horrifying results. But you can see in this an effort in some writers to write it down, to get a kind of documentary analysis of the world at large. We spoke about Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, The Communist Manifesto, 1848. Charles Darwin, On the Origin of Species, 1859. Also John Stuart Mill, Utilitarianism, in 1863. These books are all trying to objectify mass human social science, essentially. Well, not so much Darwin. Darwin is looking at biological science, but they're taking a step back and looking around at the world with a kind of objective eye and trying to write down the rules that seem to be governing it. Economics in Friedrich and Marx, evolution in On the Origin of Species, and John Stuart Mill, Utilitarianism, a look at social science and the ethics behind how people behave, one that is an ethics that is completely divorced from any real sense of religiosity or moralism. And these are all essentially nonfiction scientific works, but you can see in art of the time a similar effort to get at a kind of objective portrait of life as it is lived. Let's start with Jean-Francois Millet, The Gleaners. It comes out in 1857. Look at this portrait. It has some very distinct characteristics about it. Number one, it is an emphasis on objectivity. First of all, the eye line is very much as if somebody was just standing right there. It's not dramatized in any way. It's completely objective. It is a portrait of poverty, people who aren't necessarily seen very often in art up until this time. Think about a lot of the art that comes out of the Romantic era is sentimentalizing the common folk or heroizing the extraordinary. But here we have just very ordinary people going about an ordinary task. There's nothing heroic about them. They are a marginal subject. They are completely beside the point, let's say. In the background, you can see the grand field workers who are going along and essentially clearing this field. And these ladies are just coming around afterwards and cleaning up what's left. They are subsisting on these little scraps of hay that they can pick up after the farm, essentially, the farm workers go and harvest all of the valuable stuff. They are living on scraps, literally. And here, look at them also. You can't really see any faces. You can, but you get a sense of exactly who they are in society. They are non-individualized. They are just the common folk. So here it is a celebration. In contradistinction to romantic individualism, here society itself is greater than the individual. Society and the role of the poor as a plural aggregate is the subject over and above any sense of individuality. Another painting, Gustave Caillebotte, The Floor Scrapers of 1875. Another trio of semi-anonymous workers. They are a remarkable group of lower class artisans, let's say. You can see, just like in The Gleaners, a kind of muted color scheme. There's not much that's particularly vibrant in any of this. But if you look very closely at the muscles of these men, of the way the back is contorted, the realistic, recognizable quality to it. It has a kind of photographic quality. It is very exact. It's not trying to airbrush these people. It's not trying to make them look particularly pretty. It has a great exactness with its portrait, especially of the human form. Also in here, you can see it's very shadowy. Now, this is probably realistic. They are indoors, and there is there's no sense of the artist using light to, you know, make sure everybody looks pretty, or that you can see everything in the picture. There are shadows on faces. It's not always particularly clear. It's a use of very realistic lighting, but it's also a sign that, you know, things can be quite dark sometimes, and it's not an ideal way to see things. But also look at the settings. In Romanticism, you often have a very vague setting, a very vague background, so that it foregrounds the central figures. Here, you only see, in realism, you pretty much only see figures in a particular setting, in a particular location, and you get a real sense of them being in that location, because their individualism itself is kind of beside the point. They are put in a place to demonstrate the role of people in that place. Their public and social identity is, in this case, much greater than their individual identity. Vasily Perov, The Drowned Woman. Here's a very dramatic piece, even as it kind of undercuts its own drama. It's 1867. This is Russian. Here you can see another focus on the poor, but also a kind of criminal underclass. The woman who is lying dead is believed to be a prostitute, and she has been fished out of the river and is being watched over by this policeman. And you can see his expression as he's just sitting there, maybe waiting for his superiors to come and make a report. He's just kind of bored. He's not particularly concerned about this woman. He's not touched by her. You get a sense of the banality here. He is just, all right, it's one more dead woman that I had to pull out of the river, and I'm tired. I'm just going to sit down here and smoke my pipe and wait. In the background, you can see the skyline. It's a very urban setting where prostitutes are probably much more common, which gives you a sense of urban degradation. The cities are well developed, and they are central locations for poverty, for a lot of different people who are living, you know, some of them making honest livings like the floor scrapers, some of them just getting by like the gleaners, and some of them living in very desperate and dehumanizing situations like this woman, the drowned woman. Now, women themselves, and this woman's supposed profession as a prostitute, is a reflection of the kind of inescapable human nature that is at the very heart of realist art. The idea that no matter what we may think of ourselves, we are always very close to our animalistic roots. Here again, think Darwin and the connection of the animal and the human. We are no longer necessarily divine, so we're always identified by our in realism by some of our most bestial habits, and sexuality is tied into that. Now, I will warn that the next slide is a little bit shocking to some, so you might want to scan through it. Gustave Courbet, L'Origine du Monde, which I include in the original French because I kind of like saying L'Origine du Monde, which means the origin of the world. And, you know, make of it what you will. This is a realist view of the origin of the world. Everything comes from this. Everything human comes from this. And it is a insistently reductive definition of humanity. It's an insistently biological definition of humanity. It's graphic. Obviously, it is shocking to a degree, but it's also very objective in the way it's just showing you something. It's just putting it out there, let's say. It is not idealized. It is just right there, in your face. Again, the emphasis on the physical, on the animalistic, on the natural, on the anti-idealistic. This is an art that seeks to remind people who in the Romantic era may have been soaring above on great ideals. This is an art that is insistent on rejecting those ideals and looking at the strictest definition of what makes humanity. So, realism, you find constant themes of social determinism. The where you are from and who you are is determined by your environment. Your environment is greater than your individuality. The people as a whole is more determinative than any one element within it. It is very difficult then to rise above one's circumstances. This extends to biological determinism. We are all brought down by our biological urges, our cravings, our lusts, our hungers, our needs on a very animalistic level, on a very material level. The materialism of the art is very obvious. There is, in the exactitude and the photo quality of everything, an effort to get the material objects of a scene very precisely, because the value of those objects is often limited to their material value. There is no essence within them, so to speak. And this is all part of the overall objectivity that we see in the art. Where the portrait is not supposed to romanticize anything, or it's not supposed to idealize anything, where art is just supposed to show you this is the way it is and nothing more. Art then is documentary evidence. Art is supposed to categorize and catalog the vastness of human society, of human civilization, of human nature when possible. It is supposed to bear witness to who we are and not paint pictures of who we want to be. In literature, this takes many different forms, but primarily, I would say the great production of of literary realism is the novel, and some of the great ones. Honoré de Balzac writes bucket loads of novels that seek to categorize his Paris, the Paris of his day, and all levels of society, all different relationships, all different character types operating within this grand portrait. And all of these characters and all of these novels are interwoven in different ways. He calls the collection of them La Comédie Humaine. Over the course of his career, he just piles novel after novel after novel of all of these characters. Madame Bovary, Gustave Flaubert, 1857, a watershed novel that paints a very empathetic but not sympathetic portrait of a woman who just cannot live the romantic life she wants to, and is ultimately very disillusioned and frustrated by that. Charles Dickens, Hard Times. All of Dickens has a focus on human desperation at different times, often portraying an underclass of society, often quite unsavory underbelly of society. Leo Tolstoy, Anna Karenina, very much like Flaubert's Madame Bovary, but going even further in trying to objectify the reading experience and not play upon readers' emotions. And in the United States, Mark Twain, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a very plain, realist look through the eyes of a child at a vastly unjust society, and using that sense of irony to portray some just harrowingly dark moments or essences of human culture. So all of the characteristics of realist literature start to come into focus. It is a very unadorned style, not a lot of highfalutin language, not a lot of poetry. There is a lot of class and social consciousness. You find again and again portraits of poor people, of criminals, of distinctions among the classes. It is a largely middle class genre of literature. Realist literature plays upon the so-called bourgeois attitudes of the rising middle class, if you will, who are very concerned about the underclass, but also wanting to be distinct from them, and also frustrated with the class above them, with the aristocrats, and wanting to expose them for their supposed superiority over the middle class. And constant and relentless permutations of this theme of class and social consciousness. Within that, you get an awful lot of details of the time and place. Balzac, for one, will spend pages and pages and pages just describing every little object in a room when it has really nothing to do with the plot, and you get frustrated with it, but he's just had an entire pot of coffee to himself, and he's just listing out everything in his mind that he sees. Details, little tiny details, the idea that the story can be conveyed through artifacts because they are real and not imagined. But that sense of reality extends to the people themselves and the way they speak. Dialogue is often produced in dialect. Think in terms, again, of Huckleberry Finn, some of which is absolutely unreadable when you're trying to figure out what the characters are actually saying, because he reproduces a very specific Missouri dialect among these people. Dickens does largely the same thing in England, where the words are captured as if the characters had spoken them, not the King's English in any sense, but rather to give you a sense not just of what they're saying, but how they're saying it, and to give you as a way of taking you inside them in a non-idealized way. Very few people actually speak in complete sentences, so dialect and slang becomes much more important in capturing a real character. And that exactitude and believability of character extends to plot. Plot has to be conventional and plausible. How many times do you walk away from a book or a movie or anything and say, hey, that story was just ridiculous, that would never have happened? Well, that is the realist legacy living in you. The plot has to be believable. You have to say, all right, yeah, that looks realistic. That could happen. Otherwise, it becomes very suspect. And all of this feeds back into character, which again takes on a primacy that doesn't really come out in as much in any other period. Here, psychological depth becomes imperative. The idea that the characters have thought processes, and the novels or the narratives in general, the stories that get laid out, tend to be examinations of the ethics behind their psychology. What choices do they make? What are they? How do they behave? Why do they behave that way? Is there any way to get out of that? And of course, the answer in realism is very rarely can they get out of it. It's almost impossible in realist literature to rise above your circumstances. Your circumstances, again, are determining. Social determinism locks humanity in place. There is no rising above. There is no ultimate triumph. And this is the tragedy of realist literature. Humanity can never triumph.